Hello, cooking enthusiasts. This week's video is going to be part of an ongoing video series because so many people look for and want nice frozen desserts that don't require a specialty machine. And to be quite frank, in my opinion, most recipes for a no-churn recipe are pretty lame, generally overly sweet, overly rich, not easy to make flavor additions. So I believe the answer is the Italian dish, the Semifreddo, which is a frozen dessert that gains its structure generally from a meringue and is sliced to serve rather than scooped. So on camera, we are just measuring cream and we've added some milk powder, salt, and a little xanthan gum. This is my coffee gelato recipe from the book Gelato Obsession. And what I have done is tweaked the recipe and technique to work as a semifreddo. So because these initial dry ingredients are only going into the cream, we're just stirring it with something narrow like a chopstick and just microwaving it to help dissolve the milk powder. We don't need to specifically dissolve or activate anything for this recipe. For one of my gelato recipes, we would be working with more liquid all at once and likely using a double boiler, but the microwave is pretty nice and convenient for these small quantities. You just have to go in bursts and stir it frequently. Once the microwaving is done, it goes into a larger mixing bowl with the rest of the ingredients coming. Again, it is very thick because of the milk powder and xanthan gum, but that will be resolved shortly. The next step is measuring some coffee infused milk. So again, this is essentially cold brew, but switching out milk for water. And this is the exact same procedure I use for my coffee gelato. A big difference between the coffee gelato and semifreddo is that there is less overall milk to compensate for the egg whites we are adding later. And unfortunately, my dad also undermeasured because he didn't account for the mass of the coffee grounds. Now, my gelato recipe and the written recipe for this semifreddo in the description calls for espresso, but obviously use whatever very strong coffee you have access to. Ideally, some nice espresso shots, but also either extra strong French press or even cold brew coffee. Then we are measuring the hot coffee. One other little mistake is that this liquid should have been used to really rinse out the measuring vessel from all of the other thick ingredients. And again, that is pointed out in the written recipe. The next step is technically optional, but highly recommended. Measuring whiskey or even just some vanilla extract, primarily for the anti-freezing texture of the alcohol. The final step for this flavorful dairy base is to blend everything together with an immersion blender. It may or may not be necessary, depending on how thoroughly and slowly you mix the various ingredients, but it is sort of always good practice when working with xanthan gum and was definitely necessary this time because of the milk powder. The next step is making a hot sugar syrup for a Italian meringue, which will be the primary structure of this frozen dessert. And that's using brown sugar and lactose, which is the same sugars I use for the coffee gelato. And we are just monitoring the temperature until it reaches a first benchmark, which will then trigger us to turn on the stand mixer. Another difference with the gelato recipe is that that uses some maple syrup, and for this version of the recipe, I've replaced that with more of these dry sugars. So that first benchmark was 110 degrees Celsius, and then the final benchmark where we actually add the syrup to the egg whites is roughly 118 to 120. Unfortunately, the syrup was ready, but the egg whites were not at the right stage of whipping. But if they had been, you do not want to dilly-dally like my dad is in this clip a little bit. So off camera, we increase the stand mixer speed and get the egg whites to the proper point. But while we did that, the sugar syrup entirely solidified. So again, off camera, we just turn the stand mixer off temporarily, add a little more hot water to the sugar, redissolve it, bring it back to that proper 118 Celsius, and then we can slowly drizzle it in while the stand mixer is running on low, and then finally turn it back up to a relatively high speed. So we are jumping ahead roughly 8 minutes into the future, and the meringue seems pretty much done. As with pretty much any recipe involving whipped egg whites and similar structure, the next step is to take a portion, roughly a third, and vigorously stir it into the other component, in this case, the coffee and dairy mixture, to just begin lightening the texture. The next thing that happens is half of the flavor base is folded into the remaining meringue, which is a slight procedural mistake. I wanted one more installment of meringue to go into the glass mixing bowl. Finally, everything does get folded together. Again, it was a slight mismatch in procedure, but ultimately it did work out. What I think is a slightly better order of operations is in the written recipe in the description. Really, the only critical point is that the first stage is vigorous, and then the other installments are very delicate folding, and I don't even mind a little bit of inconsistency in the form of streaks or marbling. So after some trials and tribulations, this is the point of a Semifreddo where you get to just have fun. So in the bottom of this loaf pan is just some old Ferrero Rochers and a crumbled up coffee flavored snack cake. Then after half of the mousse is in, we add some crumbled up sort of Italian style chocolate wafer cookies, which are really delicious. Then goes the rest of the actual flavored mousse mixture. And this is one of the big differences between a semifreddo and a gelato or sorbet. The dense and creamy texture of a gelato is really important, and in general, I don't like to use too many mix-ins in general with a frozen dessert like that. Whereas with a semi-Freddo, the overall texture is so much more airy, and the meringue is providing the structure before it freezes. It lends itself to layering in different textures and visuals like this. And here is some photos of it served. Again, maybe not perfect execution, but it was a real crowd pleaser. And I think using my gelato recipe as the starting point resulted in a lot of good flavor. So if you have any questions about this recipe, please let me know. If you don't have an ice cream machine and have been waiting for a dessert like this, I hope you give it a try. I will be releasing other Semifreddo videos and again further refining a general conversion from gelato to Semifreddo. Well, thank you for watching.